The deck of the escort carrier USS Sangamon pitched and rolled through the gray waters of Chesapeake Bay on the morning of September 25, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Sam Porter, his heart a drum against his ribs, strapped himself into the cockpit of a Vought F4U Corsair. He checked his instruments, adjusted his harness, and braced for what would either be a triumph or a tragedy. This machine, America's newest fighter, was meant to humble the Japanese Zero, to shift the tide of battle in the Pacific. But what transpired in the next half hour would bring a man to the brink of death and force the Navy to confront a terrifying truth: their supposed wonder weapon might, in fact, be a lethal trap. The Navy would eventually learn that the true genius of this aircraft lay not in its initial design, but in the desperate ingenuity of those who refused to let it fail. Porter was no novice. His naval career spanned countless flight hours in every type of aircraft imaginable. Yet, as he aligned for his initial approach to the Sangamon's deck, a chilling realization washed over him. The Corsair's cockpit was set so far back in the fuselage that his forward view was almost entirely obstructed. A massive 14-foot nose, angled skyward for landing, blocked his sightline to the crucial elements below. He couldn't spot the landing signal officer, whose guiding paddles were essential for a safe touchdown. The arresting wires, vital for snagging his tailhook, were invisible. Even the frantic scramble of sailors clearing the deck, or the looming crash barrier, remained hidden. He was, in essence, flying blind towards a steel platform that danced with the ocean swells. Despite the terrifying handicap, Porter pressed on. Orders were orders. He descended, trying to piece together his altitude and position from fleeting glimpses around the huge engine cowling. The moment his wheels hit the wooden planks was a violent jolt. Then, something unprecedented occurred. The landing gear's shock absorbers, known as oleo struts, compressed and rebounded with such force that the Corsair sprang back into the air as if launched from a giant trampoline. Porter crashed down again, his tailhook skittering over the wires, the aircraft hurtling towards the crash barrier. He barely managed to apply power and climb away. His second attempt was even worse, the bounce sending him so high he nearly stalled. The third was terrifying. He caught a wire, but the plane slewed sideways, threatening to cartwheel. After his fourth landing, Porter taxied to a halt, killed the massive Pratt and Whitney engine, and climbed out, his hands visibly trembling, sweat drenching his flight suit despite the cool autumn air. He walked directly to the waiting assessment officers and delivered a stark verdict: this aircraft would kill him if he continued. The Corsair, America's fastest single-engine fighter, designed to obliterate Japanese Zeros and ensure American aerial supremacy, was deemed unfit for carrier operations. The Navy had invested 2 years and millions of dollars into an aircraft that couldn't perform its fundamental mission. They had created what would soon be infamously known as the Ensign Eliminator. The man behind this formidable, yet flawed, machine was Rex Beisel, Vought Aircraft's chief engineer. Beisel, a self-made aeronautical prodigy, had risen from a Ford draftsman to a leading designer of military aircraft. Born in San Jose, California, in 1893, he grew up in a Washington state mining town where his father toiled in the coal mines. As a teenager, Beisel worked as a breaker boy, a mule driver, and a surveyor's assistant, funding his own education to become one of America's first certified aeronautical engineers, entering the aviation industry in its nascent stages. Beisel had a reputation for tackling engineering challenges others deemed insurmountable, a confidence that had served him well throughout a career marked by successful military aircraft designs. However, the Navy's request in February 1938 would push even his considerable talents to their limit. The Bureau of Aeronautics issued a nearly impossible challenge: a single-engine, carrier-based fighter capable of maximum attainable speed, yet with a stalling speed below 70 miles per hour. It needed 4 guns, or 3 with extra ammunition, a 1,000-mile range to span the vast Pacific, and the robustness to withstand the immense stresses of catapult launches and arrested landings. Every manufacturer received the proposal. Beisel, upon reviewing the specifications, made a decision that would define the Corsair. If the Navy wanted maximum speed, he would deliver maximum speed. Everything else, handling ease, pilot visibility, and landing characteristics, would be secondary to raw performance. Beisel selected the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower, double the output of most contemporary fighter engines. No fighter had ever been designed around such a colossal power plant. The engine alone weighed nearly 2,000 pounds, consumed fuel at prodigious rates, and required a 13-foot, 4-inch propeller to translate its immense power into thrust. This massive propeller created an immediate engineering dilemma. A conventional fuselage with standard landing gear would mean the propeller tips would strike the carrier deck during landing. The landing gear struts would need to be impossibly long, rendering them fragile and susceptible to collapse. Beisel's solution was both elegant and radical, an inverted gullwing design, bending sharply downwards from the fuselage before sweeping back up. This unique configuration allowed the landing gear to attach at the lowest point of the wing bend, keeping the struts relatively short and strong while providing ample clearance for the colossal propeller. The bent wing also reduced aerodynamic drag at the wing-to-fuselage junction, adding precious speed. On May 29, 1940, Vought test pilot Lyman Bullard Jr. took the prototype XF4U, one aloft for its maiden flight. The aircraft exceeded all expectations. During flight testing over Connecticut, the Corsair became the first American single-engine fighter to breach 400 miles per hour in level flight. Navy observers watched in awe as the bent-wing fighter outpaced every other aircraft in the American arsenal. The Bureau of Aeronautics was ecstatic, awarding Vought a contract for 584 production aircraft on June 30, 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor plunged America into war. However, between the prototype and production, Navy demands for changes would transform the dream machine into a nightmare. Reports from the European Air War indicated that the original armament of 2 nose-mounted and 4 wing-mounted machine guns was insufficient against modern German fighters, which now featured armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. The Navy demanded heavier firepower, 6.50 caliber machine guns, all wing-mounted outside the propeller arc, eliminating the need for synchronization. This change necessitated relocating the fuel tanks from the wing leading edges. Beisel had to install a new 237-gallon tank in the fuselage, situated between the engine and the cockpit. The only way to accommodate this large tank while preserving the Corsair's sleek profile was to shift the cockpit nearly 3 feet rearward from its original position. This singular modification, made solely to accommodate a larger fuel tank, transformed the Corsair from a promising carrier fighter into what would soon be known as the Ensign Eliminator. The first production F4U-1 made its initial flight on June 24, 1942. Immediately, test pilots reported severe problems. The cockpit's rearward placement drastically compromised forward visibility. The framed, birdcage, canopy, designed for structural strength, further restricted the pilot's field of view. During ground handling, pilots couldn't see directly ahead. On landing approaches, the runway or carrier deck remained invisible until the final seconds before touchdown. The massive double Wasp engine leaked oil and hydraulic fluid, which seeped past the cowl flaps and smeared across the windshield. In the humid Pacific, this fluid mixed with salt spray and tropical moisture, forming an opaque film that rendered the windshield nearly useless. Pilots likened landing on a pitching deck to looking through a dirty window. The aircraft also exhibited vicious stall characteristics at low speeds. During high angle of attack maneuvering, essential for carrier landings and dogfighting, the left wing would stall before the right, causing the aircraft to snap-roll violently without warning. At low altitude, there was no time for recovery, the aircraft would simply invert and plunge. But the most terrifying problem was engine torque. The double Wasp produced such immense rotational force that it could overpower a pilot's control inputs. If an inexperienced pilot added throttle too quickly during a wave-off or go-around, the massive torque would roll the aircraft onto its back. At carrier landing altitudes of 200 feet or less, there was no time to recover, the pilot would simply roll inverted and dive into the ocean. Fighter Squadron 12, VF-12, the first squadron to receive production Corsairs, arrived at Naval Air Station San Diego in October 1942. The pilots were initially thrilled, dreaming of shooting down Zeros and becoming aces. This excitement quickly evaporated as accidents mounted. The relocated cockpit created a visibility nightmare during critical phases of flight. Pilots couldn't see over the long nose during takeoff, forcing them to S-turn down the runway to check for obstacles. During carrier approaches, they couldn't see the landing signal officer, the arresting wires, the deck edge, or the crash barrier. They were flying blind at the most dangerous moments. Ensigns, fresh from flight training on forgiving aircraft like the North American SNJ trainer, were suddenly handed the controls of a machine that punished every mistake with death. The SNJ was designed for stability and predictability, giving students time to recognize and correct errors. The Corsair offered no such forgiveness. A moment of inattention, a hand moving too quickly on the throttle, a slight miscalculation on approach, and the aircraft would try to kill its pilot. Accidents began almost immediately. Pilots died during training flights when they stalled at low altitude and couldn't recover. They died during landing practice when the aircraft bounced over the arresting wires and slammed into the crash barrier. They died during takeoff when torque rolled them into the ground before they gained enough altitude to recover. They died during formation flying when poor visibility caused collisions. The name started as dark humor among the surviving pilots of VF-12. Someone, nobody remembers who, began calling the Corsair the Ensign Eliminator. Ensigns, the Navy's lowest-ranking commissioned officers, were its youngest and least experienced pilots, and thus the most likely to die while learning to fly the unforgiving Corsair. The bitter, accurate joke spread through the squadron, then to other squadrons, and soon throughout the naval aviation community. Within months, everyone in the Pacific Fleet knew the nickname. Within a year, it would become one of the most infamous designations in American aviation history. Despite the escalating accident rate, the Navy continued carrier qualification trials. Porter's tests on the Sangamon were followed by additional trials on the training carrier USS Wolverine and the escort carriers USS Core and USS Charger. The results were consistently terrifying. Pilots reported the Corsair was nearly impossible to land on a moving deck. The bouncing was unpredictable and violent. Visibility was inadequate. All characteristics were deadly. Some evaluators attempted optimism. One official report stated the Corsair was an excellent carrier type and very easy to land aboard, no different than any other airplane. But accident statistics painted a grim picture. Corsairs crashed at rates far exceeding other naval aircraft. Pilots died in training at rates that would have been unacceptable even during combat operations. In October 1942, the Navy assigned VF-17, a new squadron under Lieutenant Commander Tom Blackburn, to become the second Navy unit equipped with Corsairs. Blackburn was determined to make the aircraft work. He established the squadron on January 1, 1943, at Naval Air Station Norfolk, recruiting aggressive, risk-taking pilots. He worked closely with Vought engineers to identify and address problems. His pilots practiced carrier landings obsessively, developing techniques to compensate for visibility limitations. Despite Blackburn's efforts, the problems persisted. During the summer of 1943, VF-17 conducted carrier qualification trials aboard USS Bunker Hill during her shakedown cruise off Trinidad. The results were maddening. Despite seemingly normal approaches, Corsairs repeatedly failed to engage the arresting wires, bouncing over the barriers and crashing into parked aircraft at the forward end of the deck. Blackburn later wrote that his aircraft were strewing expensive debris in all directions, often breaking in two at the engine mount. The first Marine Corps pilot to die in a Corsair during combat operations was not killed by the Japanese, he was killed by his own aircraft. Marine Fighter Squadron 124, VMF 124, received the first operational Corsairs in late 1942. Major William Geese commanded the squadron. The pilots trained intensively at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in California, mastering the powerful and temperamental fighter. By February 1943, they were declared combat-ready and deployed to the Pacific Theater. The squadron arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal on February 12, 1943. Henderson Field, the most contested piece of real estate in the Pacific, had been captured from the Japanese in August 1942 and defended ever since against constant air attacks and ground assaults. The runway was pocked with bomb craters and littered with wreckage. The surrounding jungle harbored Japanese soldiers who occasionally infiltrated the perimeter. VMF 124's Corsairs were early, birdcage, models with the framed canopy, further restricting visibility. They had the original landing gear oleos that bounced violently on touchdown. They lacked any of the modifications that would later make the aircraft more manageable. These were essentially the same aircraft that had nearly killed Sam Porter on the Sangamon. On February 13, the day after their arrival, the Corsairs flew their first combat mission, escorting Army Air Force B-24 bombers on a raid against Japanese positions at Kahili. They encountered no enemy aircraft and returned safely, relieved that their aircraft had performed well in the air, climbing faster and flying further than any fighter they'd previously flown. The next day, February 14, Valentine's Day, VMF 124 joined another escort mission. This time, a larger, more complex formation of Army P-38s and P-40s joined the Marines in escorting B-24s to Kahili on Bougainville. It was the longest escort mission in the Solomon Islands war to date, pushing the raid deep into Japanese territory. Over the target, Japanese fighters intercepted the formation. The engagement was a disaster. The Americans lost 2 Corsairs, 4 P-38s, and 2 bombers. The Japanese lost only 1 aircraft, a Zero whose pilot collided with one of the Corsairs. Surviving pilots reported their Corsairs felt sluggish and unresponsive compared to the nimble Zeros. Japanese fighters could turn inside them, get on their tails, and pursue them through maneuvers the Corsairs couldn't match. The engagement would later be called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, 8 American aircraft lost for a single Japanese fighter destroyed. It was a bitter introduction to combat for the Corsair, suggesting that an aircraft too dangerous to fly might also be too clumsy to fight. More pilots died in the weeks that followed. Some were shot down by Japanese fighters exploiting the Corsair's turning limitations. Others crashed on takeoff when torque rolled them into the ground. Others died on landing when the bouncing gear threw them off Henderson Field's rough runway. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, patching bullet holes and replacing damaged components, but they were fighting fundamental design problems that couldn't be fixed with wrenches and spare parts. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh was one of the pilots who survived those early weeks. Walsh had flown fighters in the peacetime Navy before Pearl Harbor and understood aircraft performance at a level most pilots never achieved. He recognized the Corsair's tremendous capabilities hidden behind its dangerous handling characteristics. He began experimenting with tactics that exploited the Corsair's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. Walsh discovered that while the Corsair couldn't turn with the Zero, it could outclimb and outdive anything the Japanese flew. The key was never to engage in a turning fight. Instead, he used the Corsair's speed to dive on enemy aircraft from above, make one firing pass with the 6.50 caliber guns, then use the Corsair's excellent zoom climb ability to regain altitude before the Japanese could react. Hit and run. Never turn. Never try to follow a Zero through a horizontal maneuver. Walsh applied these tactics with devastating effectiveness. On August 15, 1943, he shot down 4 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement. On August 30, he shot down 3 more. He became the first Corsair ace, eventually accumulating 21 aerial victories. His success proved that the Corsair could be a deadly fighter in the hands of a pilot who understood its limitations. But most pilots were not Kenneth Walsh. They were young ensigns and lieutenants with minimal combat experience. They didn't have time to develop sophisticated tactics before being thrown into combat. They made mistakes that the unforgiving Corsair punished with death. Official reports continued to blame pilot error. Maintenance logs noted no mechanical deficiencies. But everyone who flew the Corsair knew the truth: the aircraft was killing its own pilots at rates exceeding combat losses. In the spring of 1943, the Navy faced an impossible decision. They had invested enormous resources in the Corsair program. Production lines at Vought in Connecticut, Goodyear in Ohio, and Brewster in New York were building hundreds of aircraft every month. The fleet desperately needed fighters to counter the Zero. But the Corsair could not safely operate from aircraft carriers, its entire design purpose. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat offered an alternative. Grumman had designed the Hellcat specifically to address the Zero threat, incorporating lessons learned from the first year of Pacific combat. The Hellcat used the same Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine as the Corsair, but in a more conventional airframe. It wasn't as fast as the Corsair, nor could it climb as high. But it was easy to fly, forgiving of pilot errors, and most importantly, it could land on a carrier without killing its pilot. In the spring of 1943, the Navy made a choice that would shape the Pacific War. They would reassign the Corsair to the Marines for land-based operations and adopt the Grumman F-6F Hellcat as the Navy's primary carrier fighter. The Marines were accustomed to making do with equipment the Navy didn't want. They had fought on Guadalcanal with obsolete F-4F Wildcats while the Navy received newer aircraft. Now, they would receive the Corsair, an aircraft too dangerous for carrier use. VF-17, the squadron Tom Blackburn had trained specifically to take Corsairs into combat from the carrier USS Bunker Hill, received devastating news. Despite months of work developing carrier landing techniques and modifying their aircraft, the Navy was removing them from Bunker Hill. They would be sent to the Solomon Islands as a land-based squadron. An F-6F Hellcat squadron would take their place on the carrier. Blackburn was furious. His pilots had invested everything in mastering the Corsair for carrier operations. They had pushed themselves to the limits, practicing landing after landing until they could consistently put the fighter on the deck. They had worked with Vought engineers to address specific problems. They had proved the aircraft could work with the right techniques and modifications. But the Navy had made its decision. The Corsair was officially rejected for carrier duty. Blackburn had meticulously assembled his squadron, recruiting pilots he believed could handle the demanding aircraft. His executive officer was Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick, a skilled tactician who shared Blackburn's confidence in the Corsair. Hedrick would eventually shoot down 12 aircraft, becoming one of the leading aces of the Pacific War. Together, they forged a squadron culture that embraced the challenge of flying an unforgiving aircraft. The Jolly Rogers got their name from the Corsair itself. A Corsair was a pirate, and Blackburn wanted a squadron insignia reflecting that swashbuckling heritage. Artist Harry Holmier, one of the squadron pilots, designed the skull and crossbones that would become one of the most famous military insignias in American history. The pilots painted the Jolly Roger on their Corsair's cowlings and adopted the attitude that went with it. They were pirates of the sky, intending to take no prisoners. The decision to remove them from carrier duty was not entirely wrong from the Navy's perspective. The Hellcat would prove to be an excellent carrier fighter, eventually achieving an air-to-air kill ratio even higher than the Corsair. It was easier to fly, easier to maintain, and caused far fewer fatal accidents. But removing VF-17 from Bunker Hill meant America's fastest and most powerful fighter would spend most of the war flying from island airstrips instead of carrier decks. On the evening of November 10, 1943, a young maintenance officer named Butch Davenport sat in the ready room at Ondongo Airfield in the Solomon Islands. Ondongo, meaning place of death in the local language, was a forward operating base for VF-17, the Jolly Rogers. The squadron had been in combat for 2 weeks, flying missions against Japanese positions throughout the northern Solomons. Davenport was sketching modification plans on a piece of scrap paper. Working closely with Vought Field Representative Russ DeVella, he had been studying why so many pilots were dying. The Corsairs' left-wing stall was not random, nor caused by pilot error or bad luck. It happened due to specific aerodynamic characteristics of the wing design. During high angle of attack maneuvering, airflow over the left wing separated before the right wing, causing the left wing to suddenly lose lift while the right wing was still generating it. The result was a violent, unanticipated roll no pilot could prevent. Davenport and DeVella believed they had the solution. If the right wing could be made to stall simultaneously with the left, the aircraft would mush forward controllably instead of snapping into an uncontrollable roll. The way to achieve this was to subtly spoil the lift on the right wing, reducing its efficiency so it would stall at the same angle of attack as the left. They proposed adding a small strip of metal to the leading edge of the right wing, just outboard of the gun ports. This strip would disrupt airflow over the wing surface at high angles of attack, causing early separation and reducing lift. It was a crude modification any maintenance crew could fabricate from spare parts in the field. The squadron mechanics were initially skeptical. Vought engineers had designed the wing after thousands of hours of wind tunnel testing, calculating airfoil shapes and dimensions with mathematical precision. Who were they to second-guess professional aeronautical engineers with years of education and experience? But Blackburn trusted his pilots. He had built VF-17 on the principle that aggressive men who flew combat every day often understood their aircraft better than engineers who had never faced an enemy. He authorized the modification on a single aircraft as a test. The results exceeded all expectations. With the stall strip installed, the Corsairs' wings stalled simultaneously. The aircraft remained controllable at low speeds. Pilots could feel the stall approaching through buffeting in the controls and take corrective action before the aircraft departed controlled flight. The violent snap rolls that had killed so many ensigns simply stopped happening. Word spread through the squadron within hours. Other pilots demanded the modification for their aircraft. Maintenance crews worked through the night, fabricating stall strips from whatever materials they could find: carved wood blocks, bent sheet metal, aluminum strips from damaged aircraft, anything that would disrupt airflow in the right location. Within weeks, every Corsair in VF-17 carried the field improvised modification. The improvement in survival rates was immediate and dramatic. Pilots who had been hesitant to engage at low altitude began flying more aggressively. They could pursue Japanese aircraft through maneuvers that would have been suicidal weeks earlier. The Jolly Rogers went on to become the highest-scoring Navy Corsair squadron of the war, destroying 154 enemy aircraft in just 76 days of combat. 13 pilots became aces. Blackburn credited much of that success to the stall strip modification developed by the team at Ondongo. Vought engineers eventually examined the field modification and confirmed its effectiveness through wind tunnel testing. A standardized metal stall strip became standard equipment on all production Corsairs, starting with the F4U 1A model. Official documentation credited engineering analysis for the improvement. The names of Butch Davenport and Russ DeVella did not appear anywhere in the records. While American pilots struggled with the Corsair, the British Royal Navy faced a different but related problem. They desperately needed capable carrier-based fighters, and their options were severely limited. British-designed carrier aircraft like the Blackburn Skua and Fairey Fulmar were two-seat designs developed before the war for navigation over featureless oceans. They were too slow and cumbersome to compete with modern single-seat fighters. The Supermarine Seafire, a navalized version of the famous Spitfire, had excellent performance but limited range and fragile landing gear that frequently collapsed under the stress of carrier landings. The Americans offered Corsairs through the Lend-Lease program. The British accepted, fully aware of the aircraft's terrible reputation. The need was too great to refuse, any fighter was better than no fighter, and the Corsair at least offered performance that could match the best Japanese aircraft. The first Corsairs arrived in Britain in late 1943. British pilots immediately encountered the same problems that had plagued American squadrons. Forward visibility during landing approach was terrible, the long nose blocked the view of the deck and the batsman, as British pilots called the landing signal officer. The landing gear bounced violently on touchdown, throwing the aircraft back into the air and over the arresting wires. Engine torque could flip the aircraft onto its back if the pilot added throttle too quickly during a wave-off. But the British couldn't simply relegate the Corsair to land-based units as the Americans had done. The Royal Navy operated from aircraft carriers as its primary method of projecting air power. Their island bases were far from the Pacific combat zones where the Japanese threat was most acute. If the Corsair couldn't operate from carriers, it was nearly useless to the British. British engineers and pilots approached the problem with the desperation of men who had no alternative. They had to make the Corsair work on carriers, because failure meant having no effective carrier fighter at all. They started with the pilot's seat. American pilots sat low in the cockpit, their eye level barely above the canopy rail. British engineers raised the seat 7 inches, giving the pilot a higher vantage point to look over the nose during approach. This single change dramatically improved forward visibility. They modified the canopy, replacing some framework with clear panels to provide a better field of view, experimenting with different canopy shapes to reduce blind spots. They addressed the oil leak problem with characteristic British practicality. American engineers had tried to seal the cowl flaps to prevent oil from reaching the windshield. British mechanics simply wired the cowl flaps across the top of the engine compartment shut and opened the flaps on the sides. Oil and hydraulic fluid that had previously smeared across the windshield now flowed around the sides of the fuselage, where it could not obstruct the pilot's view. They clipped 8 inches off each wingtip to fit the aircraft in their smaller hangar decks, which had lower overhead clearance than American carriers. This modification had an unexpected benefit: the shorter wingspan increased wing loading, which improved the sink rate during landing approach. The Corsair became less prone to floating across the deck and missing the arresting wires. Most importantly, British pilots adapted a landing technique they had already developed for the Supermarine Seafire. In December 1941, during trials aboard HMS Illustrious, Lieutenant Commander H.P. Bramwell had recommended a curving approach for the long-nosed Seafire to keep the batsman in sight as long as possible. Now, they applied the same technique to the Corsair. Instead of the traditional straight-in approach used by American pilots, British aviators would fly a continuous curved approach from downwind to touchdown. The pilot would begin by flying parallel to the carrier on the downwind leg, then enter a gradual left turn that continued all the way to touchdown. Throughout this curving approach, the pilot could look over his left shoulder and keep the carrier deck in sight. The long nose that blocked forward vision was no longer relevant because the pilot was looking sideways, not forward. He could see the batsman's signals throughout the approach, making corrections as needed. Only at the last moment, in the final seconds before touchdown, would he straighten the aircraft and commit to landing. This technique required practice and coordination between the pilot and the batsman. Both had to understand exactly what the other was doing. But British naval aviators were experienced with difficult landing aircraft. They had already developed similar techniques for the Seafire, which had its own visibility problems due to its long nose. Applying the curved approach to the Corsair was a natural extension of existing skills. On June 1, 1943, No. 1830 Naval Air Squadron became the first British unit equipped with Corsairs. The pilots trained intensively in the United States, learning the curved approach technique and practicing until they could consistently land the aircraft on the small decks of British escort carriers. By the end of the year, British Corsairs were successfully operating from Royal Navy carriers in combat operations. The same aircraft that the American Navy had declared unsuitable for carrier operations was flying from British flight decks and shooting down German aircraft over Norway. British Corsairs provided fighter cover for strikes against the German battleship Tirpitz. They flew combat air patrol over the British Pacific Fleet during operations against Japanese positions. They proved that the Corsair could operate from carriers if pilots were properly trained and aircraft were properly modified. The Americans took notice. If the British could operate Corsairs from carriers with their smaller decks and less experienced pilots, perhaps the problems were not insurmountable after all. The modifications that eventually made the Corsair carrier capable for American operations did not come from any single source. They accumulated over months of desperate improvisation by pilots, mechanics, engineers, and administrators who refused to accept that the aircraft could not be fixed. American maintenance crews adopted the British discovery about oleo pressure. By increasing the air pressure in the oleo struts, they could make the shock absorbers stiffer and eliminate most of the bouncing that had caused so many accidents. This modification required no special parts or engineering approval. Any ground crew could adjust the pressure with standard equipment. The raised pilot seat from British modifications was incorporated into production aircraft starting with later versions of the F4U-1. The improvement in visibility was immediately obvious to pilots who had struggled with the lower seat position. Vought replaced the framed, birdcage, canopy with a clear bubble design that provided dramatically better visibility in all directions. Pilots could see the deck throughout the landing approach. They could see aircraft approaching from behind during combat. They could see the instruments without craning their necks around canopy frames. The stall strip that Butch Davenport had invented in the Solomon Islands became standard equipment. Assembly line workers at Vought, Goodyear, and Brewster installed precisely manufactured metal strips on every new aircraft. The tailwheel strut was lengthened by 6 inches to provide a more level landing attitude. This reduced the nose-up angle during touchdown and improved visibility during the final seconds of approach. Each modification was small. None of them individually would have solved the Corsair's fundamental problems, but together, they transformed the Ensign Eliminator into one of the most capable carrier fighters of the war. On April 22, 1944, the Navy officially accepted the F4U for shipboard operations following accident-free trials aboard USS Gambier Bay. The aircraft that had been officially rejected 2 years earlier was now cleared to return to the carrier decks for which it had been designed. The first Marine Corsair squadron to operate effectively from an American carrier was VMF 124, the same unit that had suffered through the St. Valentine's Day massacre more than a year earlier. They joined the USS Essex at Ulithi on December 28, 1944, becoming the first Marine squadron based on a fleet carrier. The pilots who landed on Essex's deck were flying fundamentally the same aircraft that Sam Porter had nearly died testing in Chesapeake Bay, same engine, same wing, same basic airframe, but the accumulated modifications had turned a killer into a weapon. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington took command of Marine Fighter Squadron 214, the Black Sheep, on August 14, 1943. At 31 years old, he was a decade older than most of his pilots and a veteran of aerial combat in China with the American volunteer group, the famous Flying Tigers. He had shot down aircraft before most of his new pilots had learned to fly. Boyington received a collection of pilots nobody else wanted, replacements who had missed their original squadron assignments due to illness or administrative errors, and others cast off from other units for disciplinary problems or personality conflicts. The Marine Corps gave Boyington 4 weeks to turn this collection of orphans into a combat-ready squadron. He did it by flying the Corsair harder than anyone thought possible. Boyington pushed the aircraft to its absolute limits and showed his pilots what it could do in the hands of someone who understood its capabilities and respected its limitations. He demonstrated that the Corsair, despite its terrifying reputation, was a magnificent fighting machine. The aircraft was faster than any fighter the Japanese flew. It could dive away from any zero at speeds that would tear the Japanese fighter apart. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns could tear an enemy aircraft to pieces with a single well-aimed burst. Its rugged construction could absorb tremendous battle damage and keep flying. Pilots returned from combat with holes in their wings, fuselage, and tail that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. The Black Sheep went into combat on September 12, 1943, and immediately proved that the Corsairs' reputation as a killer could be redirected toward the enemy. In their first week of operations, they shot down multiple Japanese aircraft while losing only one of their own. During their first combat tour, they destroyed 97 Japanese aircraft. 9 of Boyington's pilots became aces, shooting down 5 or more enemy aircraft. Boyington himself claimed 22 kills with the Black Sheep, bringing his total to 28, counting his victories with the Flying Tigers. He became the highest-scoring Marine ace of the war and one of the most famous pilots in the Pacific. On January 3, 1944, Boyington led a fighter sweep over Rabaul, the massive Japanese base that dominated the Southwest Pacific. He was trying to tie the American record of 26 aerial victories, held since World War I. During the engagement, Boyington shot down 1 Japanese aircraft, his 28th kill, before being shot down himself by enemy fighters. He parachuted into the water and was captured by a Japanese submarine crew. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, enduring brutal treatment that would have broken most men. The Japanese never reported his capture. For 18 months, the Marine Corps listed him as missing in action, presumed dead. When Boyington was liberated in August 1945, he returned to a hero's welcome. President Harry Truman presented him with the Medal of Honor that had been posthumously awarded when everyone thought he was dead. The Black Sheep's record stood as proof that the Corsair was never really the problem. The problem had always been asking young pilots to fly an unforgiving aircraft before anyone understood how to make it forgiving. The Japanese noticed the changes in American Corsair tactics almost immediately. Pilots who had learned to exploit the F4U's weaknesses found that those weaknesses had largely disappeared. The fighter that used to stall and spin at low altitude now maintained control through maneuvers that would have been suicidal in earlier versions. The aircraft that had been easy prey in a turning fight now rolled with unexpected authority thanks to the stall strips and other modifications. Japanese combat reports from late 1944 and early 1945 noted that American Corsair pilots were flying more aggressively and achieving better results. Japanese aviators initially attributed the change to improved American training or tactics. Only gradually did they realize that the aircraft itself had evolved. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was significant. For 2 years, they had owned the turning fight. Their A6M0 fighters could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew, and they knew it with absolute certainty. That confidence had allowed them to engage aggressively and press attacks that more cautious tactics would have avoided. They could get behind an American fighter and stay there through any maneuver the American attempted. When the Corsairs suddenly became competitive in maneuvering combat, Japanese pilots lost their psychological edge. Some became hesitant, breaking off attacks they would have pressed in earlier months. Others compensated by taking greater risks, closing to shorter range before firing and pursuing Americans into situations they could not escape. Aggression without superiority meant death. By early 1945, the kill ratio had shifted dramatically. Corsairs were destroying Japanese aircraft at a rate of 11-1. For every Corsair lost to enemy action, 11 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky. American pilots flew over 64,000 combat missions in Corsairs during the war. They claimed 2,140 air-to-air victories against only 189 Corsairs lost to enemy aircraft. No other American fighter achieved a better combat record in the Pacific theater. The F4U continued to serve long after the war in the Pacific ended. When fighting broke out in Korea in June 1950, Marine and Navy Corsairs were still operational. These aircraft had been in service for nearly a decade, yet they remained among the most capable ground attack platforms available. They flew from carriers offshore and from land bases in South Korea, supporting American and South Korean troops with bombs, napalm, rockets, and strafing attacks. On August 3, 1950, VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron that Pappy Boyington had made famous, flew their first combat mission of the Korean War. They launched from the escort carrier USS Sicily and attacked enemy installations near Incheon. The same squadron that had terrorized Japanese pilots over the Solomon Islands was now fighting a new enemy with the same aircraft that had served them so well in the previous war. The Corsair excelled in the close air support role. Jet fighters like the F-80 Shooting Star and the F-9F Panther were faster, but they consumed fuel at prodigious rates and could only loiter over the battlefield for minutes. The Corsair could circle above friendly troops for extended periods, waiting for calls for support, then dive in with devastating accuracy. Ground crews loved the Corsair because it was simple to maintain and could absorb tremendous battle damage. Pilots brought back aircraft with holes in wings, fuselage, and tail that would have destroyed more fragile jets. Lieutenant Guy Bordelon became the Navy's only ace of the Korean War flying a Corsair night fighter. Between late June and mid-July 1953, Bordelon shot down 5 enemy aircraft, including Soviet-built Lavochkin fighters and Yakovlev trainers used for night harassment raids. He was also the only American ace in Korea who achieved all his victories in a propeller-driven aircraft, a testament to the Corsair's enduring combat effectiveness. On September 10, 1952, Marine Captain Jesse Falmer was flying an F4U on a ground attack mission over North Korea when he encountered a Soviet-built MiG-15 jet fighter. The MiG was one of the most advanced combat aircraft in the world, capable of speeds approaching 650 miles per hour and able to climb to altitudes the Corsair could never reach. Most pilots in Falmer's situation would have tried to escape, diving for the deck and running for friendly territory. Falmer attacked. He maneuvered his vintage Corsair into a firing position and sent a burst of 20mm cannon fire into the jet fighter. The MiG went down, its pilot unable to believe that a propeller-driven antique had gotten guns on him. A fighter designed in 1938 had shot down one of the most advanced jet fighters in the world. Other MiGs arrived and shot Falmer down in turn, but he parachuted to safety over the Yellow Sea and was rescued by a Navy helicopter. The Corsair had proved that even in the jet age, it remained a formidable weapon in the hands of a skilled pilot. The French Navy operated Corsairs during the First Indochina War against Viet Minh forces from 1950 to 1954. French pilots flew ground attack missions from aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin, supporting troops fighting in the jungles of Vietnam years before American involvement escalated. The Corsair saw combat again during the Suez Crisis of 1956 and the Algerian War. Some Corsairs were still flying combat missions nearly 20 years after Sam Porter's terrifying test on the Sangamon. The last Corsair rolled off the production line on January 30, 1953. It was the longest production run of any piston-engine fighter in American history, a remarkable achievement for an aircraft that had once been considered too dangerous to fly from carriers. Rex Beisel, the engineer who had designed the Corsair around the impossible demands of maximum speed, lived to see his creation vindicated. He remained at Vought until the early 1950s, eventually becoming vice president of United Aircraft Corporation before retiring to Sarasota, Florida. He had been right about what the aircraft could achieve, he had simply underestimated how difficult it would be to unlock that potential. The modifications that made the Corsair great were not failures of his original design, they were the natural evolution of any complex machine, as engineers and operators learned to understand its true capabilities. That is how innovation actually happens in war, not through clean designs that work perfectly from the beginning, but through desperate improvisation by people who refuse to accept failure. The Corsair earned its nickname honestly. It was an Ensign Eliminator. It killed young pilots who did not know how to fly it, whose training had not prepared them for its demands. But it became something greater because men like Butch Davenport, Russ DeVella, Tom Blackburn, and the British pilots who adapted the curved approach refused to let the killing continue. Every modification was a choice, every improvement represented someone deciding that the next pilot did not have to die. The raised seat, the stall strip, the bubble canopy, the curved approach, the increased oleo pressure, small changes, individually insignificant, that together saved hundreds of lives and helped win a war. The final count tells the story: 2,140 victories against 189 losses, an 11-to-1 kill ratio that no other American fighter matched in the Pacific. 64,000 missions flown, numbers that seemed impossible when Sam Porter climbed out of his cockpit on the Sangamon and told the Navy that their wonder weapon was trying to kill him. The Corsair did not become a legend because it was perfectly designed. It became a legend because imperfect people refused to give up on an imperfect machine. They found solutions that the original designers missed. They invented techniques that no one had taught them. The men who fought against America left the most honest record of its power. Battlescars brings you one of those stories every single day. If this one held you to the end, subscribe, tomorrow's story is already waiting. And your next one is right here.